Recording started. Welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. So today we're going to be talking about PAS 2030-35. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Cassandra Dove. I'm part of the policy team at SFHA. Just a little bit of background to the session before we get started. So this came as a request from the Energy and Net Zero Forum. But we thought it kind of warranted a bit more of an in-depth discussion rather than the sort of 10-15 minutes we usually get in the forum presentations. So that's why we've decided to do this one as a standalone session. So delighted that we've got our colleagues from Changeworks and Warmworks to do a little bit of a presentation on the standards themselves. And then we're going to move into a Q&A. If there's any sort of questions from the audience, we can have a bit more of a discussion. So before I pass on to the speakers, just a few housekeeping things from me. So when you join the session, your microphone will be muted, but if you'd like to ask a question at any point, then please raise your hand and unmute yourself. And if you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. If you prefer, you can post questions in the chat as well, though. And yeah, it's helpful if you have everybody on just so we can see you all, but if not, then you can turn that off as well. We are recording the session, but we'll only be recording the sort of presentation element. We'll switch that off once we get to the Q&A. And the recording is only going to go out to the delegates attending today. So it will be shared elsewhere. That's everything from me. So I think we'll just get started then. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I will hand over swiftly to our presenters, Ewan and Jonathan. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Right, everyone see that okay? Right, good.
Yes.
So I'm Ewan Lockhead. I'm a senior consultant with Changeworks in energy efficient retrofit. I'm an architect, passive house designer and retrofit coordinator. So for those of you who don't know who Changeworks are, we're an environmental charity. Our mission is to deliver high impact solutions for low carbon living. And over the last 30 years, we've worked with partners and funders, supporters across Scotland to make a positive low carbon living a reality. Our priority and expertise lie in finding practical ways to cut carbon and promote sustainable energy and help people enjoy a more eco-friendly lifestyle. And recently we've just introduced our new strategic plan, which is focused on reducing carbon emissions in Scotland's housing. So before we move on to discussing PAS 2035, just let's look at the big picture first. And really retrofit is mostly about reducing demand in buildings in the pathway towards achieving net zero. And currently, the transition towards net zero means transitioning gas heating and hot water to electricity. So currently the peak thermal load in the UK is around 170 gigawatts, which is delivered mostly by gas. And the size of the electricity grid is projected to be 100 gigawatts by 2050. So reducing and shifting demand is essential to ensure that a renewable energy grid can cope with additional loads from transportation and heating, while reducing the infrastructure required to meet that demand. In the UK, we have some of the most inefficient buildings in Europe, with domestic buildings losing on average around 3 degrees of temperature every 5 hours, which is double the amount of other comparable Northern European countries. The scope for reducing demand is therefore huge, and the general consensus is...
Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think it's moving through the slide. We're still just seeing the title slide.
Oh dear.
That's it. So that's it on the big picture one now.
Right. And can you see it full screen, or is it just?
It was still kind of shown in the sort of window, so it wasn't on the slideshow.
Right. Can you see that screen now, or is that sharing something else?
We can still see it, yeah, but you can still sort of see your notes at the bottom and everything.
Run.
So you might need to actually start the presentation.
Yeah, I'll need to start the presentation again, I think. Sorry about that. Right. Right, is that better? Is that cycling through?
There we go, that's it, yeah.
Right, good, sorry. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
So yeah, it helps when you can see these when I'm describing the challenge. So really, yeah, this shows what I was talking about just there, that the general consensus is that demand reduction should be through fabric first retrofit. So where does PAS 2035 come in? PAS 2035 is currently non-statutory guidance for retrofitting dwellings to improve energy efficiency. It's focused on whole house fabric first approach to retrofit, and the key elements of it are that it requires an assessment prior to carrying out retrofit works to identify dwelling specific risks and constraints. With the exception of the simplest measures, retrofit measures and interfaces between measures must be designed for the specific building, and the performance of buildings must be evaluated at the end to ensure predicted savings are achieved in practice. And it's also worth saying what PAS 2035 is not. It's not an energy standard. It's purely about this process of retrofit. So it doesn't set any targets for where we need to get to. The origins of PAS 2035 are in the Each Home Counts review, which was by the Department for Business and Energy and Industrial Strategy. And that review really found that current practice focused too much on single measures like you'd find in your EPC. And it gave 27 recommendations for improvement of domestic retrofit. One of those was an overarching standards framework, which is really where PAS 2035 has come from, and their recommendation was that that was overseen by qualified professionals, and that there would be a new quality mark for retrofit, and that quality mark is Trustmark, which is the certifying body for PAS 2035 compliant retrofit in the UK. So the difference between current practice and PAS 2035. Current practice, as I say, is focused on single measures. And when I say single measures, it's usually recommendations from an RDSAP assessment. And currently grant funding has kind of been designed around these measures. And PAS 2035, by contrast, looks at a whole house approach. So considering the interaction between energy efficiency measures, for example, the impact that improving insulation has on ventilation, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. So current practice is, as I say, based on RDSAP, which is a very simplified energy modelling software, which produces an EPC assessment, whereas PAS 2035 is based upon either full SAP or the Passive House Planning Package, which requires far greater input, which gives you a better accuracy of modelling. In current practice, it's uncommon to consider the impact of measures on the internal environment, whereas that's one of the key aspects of PAS 2035 is to ensure that the measures carried out don't lead to inadequate ventilation, for example. Current practice prioritises cost rather than carbon savings. PAS 2035 balances both cost and carbon savings, and also includes evaluation to ensure that projects are delivering the energy performance that they were modelled to deliver. And a key bit of terminology in PAS 2035 is unintended consequences, and this is what we're looking to avoid through using PAS 2035. So in current practice, some of the unintended consequences of poorly designed retrofit measures have been fabric decay through failure to consider the moisture balance of the existing building and how adding insulation disrupts that balance. That can lead to surface mold and condensation. That can lead to poor indoor air quality in its own, but also unintentionally improving air tightness can make natural ventilation no longer suitable for the building. Improving insulation can sometimes also lead to overheating, which we might have experienced this summer. The fabric decay in historic buildings can lead to the loss of historic buildings. And also there's the performance gap, which is the difference between the predicted energy performance from, for example, RDSAP and what's actually been achieved, which is dependent on numerous things such as occupancy factors and the accuracy of modelling. There's the rebound effect, which is not actually knowing exactly how much energy someone uses before. For example, people might underheat their homes if they're in fuel poverty. So the actual savings are less than you would expect. And also the materials that we use for retrofit, sometimes those materials might have high carbon emissions from producing those materials, and not considering that in retrofit can lead to not having the carbon savings as you expected. So that's what we're trying to avoid with PAS 2035, and in some cases, these unintended consequences can lead to retrofit getting a bad name and also lead to expensive remediation. So the photos here show some examples of poor retrofit where you've got discontinuous insulation or water not shedding but actually shedding into the building. And that, in this particular project in Preston, the remediation of those retrofit measures actually cost more than the original retrofit scheme. So we really want to avoid that. Is it required? This is really the big question. Currently, it's only required for eco-funded projects, but it is being considered in Scottish Government reviews of energy standards. The response to the ZEST report was that there were plans for a Scottish trust mark, which follows the principles of PAS 2035, but takes into account some of the key challenges we have in Scotland around the supply chain and the skills, which might mean a phased implementation. But it's fair to say that there's uncertainty about how PAS 2035 is going to be implemented in Scotland and when it's going to be implemented. But there are plans to formalise PAS 2035 as a British standard. I think, in summary, while it's not required just now, it's likely to be required at some level soon, and it's likely to play a key role in the mass rollout of retrofit required to achieve net zero. So what does the process look like? I'll explain this in more detail in the next slides, but the whole retrofit process is overseen by one professional who is a retrofit coordinator. So the retrofit coordinator is a building professional that has a specific qualification in managing risk in retrofit projects. And it follows the steps that are set out in this slide, which are at the project inception to agree the intended outcomes, and then have a risk assessment that's specific to the building and the scale of the project, a dwelling assessment that is based on the level of risk of both the building and the measures that you're planning to install, improvement option evaluation, which again is about looking at more detailed energy modelling than you would do in RDSAP, and where you're phasing measures, making sure that when you phase them, that the compatibility between measures is there at each phase, so that you're incrementally improving a building rather than having to revisit work. Also, design. Most PAS 2035 retrofit projects will need a design so to take into account the interaction between measures, and installation, which covers handover, operation and maintenance, commissioning, the competence of the people that are installing the measures, and finally monitoring and evaluation to ensure that once you've completed all the works, that the retrofit is delivering what you wanted it to. And the plan is that the monitoring evaluation would lead to improved delivery in the next projects, so that you're constantly learning from retrofit, whole house retrofit, which is still quite it's in the early stages of adoption in the UK. So just to explain the roles a bit more, the retrofit coordinator is the key person in PAS 2035 role, and that might be an architect or an architect technologist, asset manager, building services engineer, building surveyor, construction managers, energy assessors, or a consultant or site foreman. So someone that has got experience of managing construction projects and has the level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and retrofit and risk management. But there are other roles under PAS 2035. There's the retrofit advisor, which for all intents and purposes is a retrofit coordinator, but might just be someone who's giving advice at the early stages of projects. the retrofit assessor. So this is a role for people who currently are domestic energy assessors to become retrofit assessors to assess the buildings and provide that assessment to the retrofit coordinator to inform the improvement option evaluation. Retrofit designers, again, that could also be a retrofit coordinator with the appropriate qualifications, but it could also be a different professional, such as an architect, architectural technologist, someone who is able to design retrofit measures and has the professional qualification to do that. Retrofit installers, the requirements for installers are set out under PAS 2030, and I'll let Jonathan explain that a bit more in his presentation. And then retrofit evaluators, again, it's the same qualifications as a retrofit coordinator, but retrofit evaluators are independent from the main retrofit coordinator. So that ensures that essentially retrofit coordinators aren't marking their own homework. Key concepts of PAS 2035. Fabric first. What that means is that we improve the fabric and reduce the heat loss from a building prior to focusing on services to reduce demand. And that has a number of co-benefits such as improved comfort, occupant comfort, and more resilience in the face of rising energy costs. Whole house assessment means that we're considering everything in the house. We're considering the services, the occupants, as well as the fabric, to understand the interaction with the new measures that we're putting in. No insulation without ventilation. When we're installing insulation, we can unintentionally improve air tightness, which can lead to poor indoor air quality. So a ventilation assessment is required whenever insulation is proposed. No regrets. So no regrets, it means that we're planning retrofit measures in such a way that we're not necessarily, like, for example, if we install an air source heat pump now and then insulation in 10 years time, we don't want to have to come back and move the air source heat pump and all the connecting services in order to install that insulation. So it's about planning measures to work with each other and to be phased in a logical manner. Concentrating on the interfaces. So as we saw from the example in Preston, sometimes external wall insulation will not consider, it will be chased around gas boxes, and it will be the rainwater pipes will not be taken off to put the insulation on. And these interfaces are actually really important to achieve the energy demand reductions that we want to achieve. So we do need to think about designing these measures and how and detailing of fabric measures for retrofit. And intended outcomes is another key concept, is that we need to establish what we want to achieve, whether that's net zero or whether that's just slightly improved comfort, so that we can establish the performance of the project. And then also the performance gap, trying to reduce the difference between the existing between our modeled energy consumption and what we actually achieve in practice. So just to explain in a little bit more detail of the steps, in risk management, and this is really the first step of PAS 2035, when a retrofit coordinator establishes which risk grade for a project has when it's going through each step. So there's 3 risk grades, A, B, and C. So risk grade A requires very simple assessment of the building, whereas risk grade C requires a more comprehensive assessment. I think for most registered social landlords, projects will be risk pass C due to scale, because risk pass C comes in when there's more than 30 properties to be improved in a project, or more than 5 measures per dwelling. And I think to get to net zero, it's likely that most projects would be risk pass C. Some measures are more inherently risky than others. For example, internal wall insulation has more chance of disrupting the moisture balance, and air source heat pumps require potentially fabric upgrades, so they're always risk path C. And all listed buildings and high-rise buildings are risk path C because of the increased experience of the design team that you need to undertake those projects. And the listed buildings and traditional buildings, all pre-1919 buildings, require someone with conservation expertise. So once you've established the risk, you can move on to retrofit assessment, and that's based on the risk assessment. And it's really to form an understanding of the existing building, the defects, to make sure that they're remedied prior to installing retrofit measures, and also to understand the moisture characteristics of the current building fabric. This is supported by energy and technical modelling to establish a baseline performance, so that when you get to the monitoring stage, you can understand exactly how much energy you've saved, rather than based on currently we'd base it on an RDSAP assessment, which might not be representative of the actual energy consumption. The retrofit assessment informs the improvement option evaluation, and this image here is what's called a measures interaction matrix. So here you can see that where there's red cells, these measures wouldn't be compatible with each other, and they should never be recommended at the same time. So this really informs how measures interact with each other and whether a design will be needed for installation of these measures. Another part of the improvement option evaluation is to establish the payback period and also the carbon savings of each measure, to ensure that we've looked at what's the most cost-effective way to reduce carbon emissions based on a number of improvement packages. And as I've said before, this is based on more detailed energy modelling than currently, more detailed than RDSAP, which has the effect of improving the accuracy of modelling. Then when we move on to retrofit design, that needs to be tailored to the risk path as well. So more risky projects require more design, and that needs to consider junction details for insulation, the ventilation strategy, overheating assessment, interaction between measures, so how measures actually interact in terms of, as I've said, with insulation and ventilation, or services and fabric heat loss, for example. And we also need to have an air tightness strategy, so that when we put on insulation, we're not increasing the moisture risk through unintended air infiltration, actually putting a lot of moisture into the building fabric. And then installation is carried out in accordance with PAS 2030, which Jonathan will describe some of the installation projects that Warmworks have done. And this really covers the requirements for testing, commissioning, and that needs to be confirmed at the design stage. So the retrofit design informs the installation. And then finally, evaluation. So in every project, you do a basic evaluation, and if it's performing as expected, then that's great. But where it's not, you need to undertake further evaluation to identify exactly where the problems have occurred. And the advanced monitoring might include detailed technical monitoring, such as thermography, air pressure testing, or temperature and relative humidity monitoring. So the key challenges to achieving PAS 2035, we have a skills gap in Scotland, and in the more rural areas that's more acute. So we need training. Currently the training is mostly provided by the Retrofit Academy down in England, but there are online courses. But it is a big challenge to get to upskill the industry to meet the step change in practice that PAS 2035 presents. There's also measures-based funding can make it difficult for PAS 2035, partly because, for example, ventilation doesn't have any specific funding, and it doesn't improve EPC ratings, despite the fact that it does, when implemented correctly, improve occupant comfort and can lead to significant energy savings in practice. And there's also uncertainty over implementation, so we don't know to what extent PAS 2035 is going to be used in the retrofit of Scottish housing stock. So how our change works using PAS 2035, we're using it to inform retrofit strategy in our stock analysis, and we're implementing it in the delivery of retrofit projects. Our consultancy team can provide retrofit coordination services, and our impact evaluation team are able to undertake technical monitoring to support evaluation. And this is really under our net zero pathways service. I'll just skip through this, but what we're looking to do is look at baseline reporting and modelling of archetypes, so specific buildings with similar characteristics, to find measures and approaches that are that can be rolled out at scale. We're also looking at how we fund and the business models around PAS 2035, such as heat as a service. We're looking at our delivery strategy and how we upgrade that to PAS 2035 to make sure that we've got retrofit coordinators to support projects all the way through the process, and also inform project program and project delivery for example, integrating maintenance with improvement measures to ensure that we're not duplicating work. And a really important thing is supporting tenants to understand the different technologies that might be involved in a whole house retrofit. And our impact evaluation team, as I've said, can support the understanding whether these measures have been successful. And that's the elements of our net zero pathways service. So as I've said, archetype analysis is looking at different types of housing within a local authority or housing association stock, and then identifying, the construction type. And usually these construction types will have similar approaches that we can implement. So that goes into the strategy development, that we can look at developing a single strategy for a housing stock based on the construction type, and look at implementing that to coincide with planned maintenance, and also look at integrating with local authority local heat and energy strategies, which are it makes sense for local authorities and housing associations to be speaking to each other to ensure that we're not significantly retrofitting a project when there's a heat network being installed right next by that requires a different level of heat demand. And we're also looking at integrating PAS 2035 into our delivery. So retrofit coordination, this is a service that we can provide from inception to completion. Project management, our team is currently experienced at delivering energy efficiency measures at scale, but we're looking to add in the retrofit coordination services into this part of the work that we do, and also quality assurance, our team, to ensure that the appropriate standards and on-site evidence are gathered to ensure that Trustmark accreditation can be achieved when that's rolled out in Scotland. So I'll pass on to Jonathan now to the Warmworks presentation.
Thank you, Ewan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for logging on today, and also to the Federation for the invitation. So I'm Jonathan Burke. I'm the Retrofit Centre of Excellence Manager within Warmworks. So I'm going to run through some of the considerations around PAS 2035 delivery and some of the issues that might be faced as part of that. I'll give you a quick overview of who Warmworks is and some of the projects we've been involved in, and then drill down into a bit more detail around specifically some of the contracting models that are out there within the world of domestic retrofit, some of the issues and challenges to overcome involving engaging residents in the process, build a wee bit more on some of the content Ewan's delivered there regarding data analysis, but also highlight some considerations to you all around specifications and standards that can be applied. So who's Warmworks? Well, as most of you, I hope, would know, we were formed back in 2015 as a joint venture between the Energy Saving Trust, Changeworks and Everwarm. And since then, in our capacity as the managing agent of the Scottish Government's National Fuel Poverty Programme, Warmer Homes Scotland, we have supported more than 29,000 households up here. Interestingly, that scheme has not been delivered to the PAS 2035 standard. However, it does involve multi-measure retrofit installations within domestic properties. And in addition to that, we recognise we have a role in supporting the communities in which we work and live, and delighted to share that we've supported the creation of more than 700 jobs, 150 apprenticeships and over 3,000 training opportunities, both within Warmworks and our supply chain. Now, some of the projects that we're involved in, so Warmer Homes Scotland there on the left, as you'll see, covers every single postcode area in the country. However, as a proud Scotsman working for a Scottish company, I must deviate somewhat today, folks, and relate some of the experiences from the delivery of our Sustainable Warmth programme down in Greater London and the South East. And there's a very simple reason for that. Those works are all being conducted to the PAS 2035 standard, and that probably involves 99% of what I focus on a day-to-day basis. But I've also highlighted some other projects we've been involved in, and I'll give you a link at the end towards a recent publication for a net zero heat programme we delivered on behalf of Angus Housing Association, with some content published last week. But it's important approaching retrofit to conduct a fair amount of pre-procurement considerations and exercises, in particular around which contracting model will be adopted as part of the delivery programme. So a couple of years ago, the hub based in the northwest of England commissioned the Retrofit Academy to look into this in greater detail and provide some guidance out to local authorities and RSLs on ways to comply with the standard and ways to structure the delivery, in particular looking at the role of the retrofit coordinator, how it works regards retrofit assessing, what considerations are out there regards indemnities, insurance coverage, liability, etc. And I'll have to credit the Retrofit Academy for a fair amount of the content that I'm going to share with you today. But I have put a link there at the bottom, so if you want to have a wee read through some of their findings in greater detail, please feel free. Now, the slides, as Karen mentions in the chat, will be sent to you after today's presentation. So some of the more text-heavy content, I'm not going to go through line by line. You'll be pleased to hear. You can feel free to refer to that at your leisure, but I will touch upon a few of the key takeaways. So in terms of the contracting models, so right from the get-go, when we look at how do we actually deliver on a programme, there are different ways that you can structure the shape that this will follow. So 4 models were identified by the Retrofit Academy, and typically this involves how much involvement do you want to have using an in-house resource or a directly subcontracted resource, or how much would you rather delegate responsibility for certain activities to others through your procurement process. So a managed assessment, coordination and evaluation model would essentially involve you, say, as an association, contracting the assessment, coordination and evaluation activities to one organisation who will conduct those on your behalf. You would then separately, but concurrently with that, look at appointing an installer who will be responsible for the design and installation of measures. So obviously it's imperative that each of those 2 functions overlap and data is transferred between all the participants involved. You also have within local assessment the option to do that, but to very much bring that in-house, but that's not without its own resource considerations. If you were looking at employing, for example, retrofit coordinators or upskilling your own stock condition surveyors, maintenance officers who may be domestic energy assessors at the moment to become retrofit assessors, and then to consider the implications about additional time that will be spent whilst they're out and about in the field conducting those assessments. Then you have the managing agent with contractor design and installation model. which is essentially what we deliver down in the Greater South East on behalf of the Greater South East Net Zero Hub, who've been appointed by the UK government, by BASE, to deliver on the LAD2 programme. Sorry that this is very jargon heavy, but hopefully all will become clear. But essentially in that model, you can delegate everything to one organisation to be responsible for all parts of the process. Okay. Similarly, there's a contractor-led turnkey retrofit model following a similar pattern, where you divest absolutely everything across to an organisation, from coordination to assessing to design and installation. However, with the subtle difference there, that is an installer-led organisation. So hopefully, depending on the way that you currently procure services through the association and what sort of historic and current relationships you have in place with contractors in the industry who may themselves have become more and more involved in the world of domestic retrofit, as you can see, there's a particular model for you to follow. So some of the stuff I've pilfered here from the Retrofit Academy, you can feel free to go through at your leisure, but the flow charts are extremely useful to help give you an idea over how to differentiate who's responsible for what when the managing agent comes in, or whether you're doing it yourself, but also to help highlight some of the pinch points that might be associated with issues around communication and participants in the process all being aware of what's taking place. But as you can see on this particular slide, that's where Warmworks fits in with our works in the Greater South East, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you after today's presentation. I will give you my own contact details together with colleagues in business development if you were keen to seek some advice separately. One thing that I would add with the contractor-led turnkey retrofit is just to be conscious of that having the highest potential for conflicts of interest between participants in the process. It can also be a bit restrictive in terms of opportunities it might represent for local supply chains to be installed. So we effectively manage a supply chain down in the Greater South East of 35 retrofit installation companies. So they each have the relative and respective PAS 2030, 2019 schedules for each of the individual measures that they are responsible for the installation of. However, we oversee all activities that take place rather than having a direct connection between the installers and the client. So a summary there of the models that I've touched upon with you, where the first couple will offer a simpler separation of the client and the contractor's interests, so therefore mitigate any likelihood of conflicts of interest, whereas the other models will work, but it's worth being aware about having to pay a bit more attention to what's taking place in terms of communication between each of the participants. But what kind of issues have we been encountering? Well, resident engagement is probably the most pressing. So referrals will come into Warmworks via the Greater South East Net Zero Hub, and then it's up to us to appoint retrofit assessors, coordinators, and so on and so forth to deliver. So what we would always recommend in dealing with clients is the importance of early engagement, which is a lot of common sense, folks, but typically the way that we look at that is to look at what residents groups might exist at the moment, and what communication media should be used to help spread the word that there are some retrofit activities coming to town, and what's the most important way to capitalise on resident engagement that's involved. I've seen anecdotally one organisation whose name escapes me had created some really good content for Facebook, would you believe? They pushed it out among the residents' Facebook groups to help literally in getting people through the door of properties to conduct those assessments. And we're more than happy to engage with you further on considerations around that. I've put for your reference some of the questions that crop up at various stages, and then some of the questions that are worthwhile asking of the residents at various points in the process, because as you'll see, the general driver tends to be around what's the work going to involve? How disruptive will it be? What's in it for me? What will I get out of this, etc., etc. And there's certainly a lot to be said for preempting a lot of those questions that will be asked of the respective participants within that, together with some additional questions that would be worth sharing with any tenant liaison officers you might have in advance of reaching out to engage with the local communities. So, like I say, I won't go line by line through these slides. There's a lot of content there for you to refer to at your leisure, and a bit more bedtime reading as well. But feel free to give me a shout anytime on anything that you encounter throughout. Data analysis and specification is a fundamental part when we look at delivering on a PAS 2035 programme. Now, interestingly, this doesn't necessarily relate to large-scale EPC stock condition analysis and looking across the entire portfolio. This is very much building upon what Ewan mentioned around the improvement options evaluation that's created for each of the properties. So there's a snapshot there of what an improvement option looks like. And the reason I highlight this to you is because the improvement options evaluation will very much build on the data gathered from the EPC and or energy report. So as long as an RDSAP assessment is completed as part of a retrofit assessment, that's fine, whether that's been for an energy report or an EPC. But as we all know, the EPC is fairly agnostic. It will recommend whatever the software and the methodology suggest is appropriate for that property, and that will be mirrored by the retrofit coordinator. But the significant part of that is that when the retrofit coordinator conducts much more in-depth number crunching around costs, paybacks, energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 that will be saved, etc., etc., that may or may not relate directly into the precise scope of the scheme you're delivering. So, for example, on this particular improvement options evaluation, you'll see that one of the top recommendations is for solid floor insulation to be installed. It's out with the scope of the scheme. So that can be an interesting conversation, because this documentation is client facing, and very often the resident might come along and say, improvement option evaluation and the EPC recommends I get a new boiler, or I get solid floor insulation, or I get other things that may or may not be within the scope of the specification. So it's important that frontline staff, particularly those in customer service roles, are well aware of what's covered and what isn't covered, because whilst their advice isn't their position isn't necessarily to offer retrofit advice, that can help preempt tenant dissatisfaction over what they feel they may be receiving as part of the delivery programme. And essentially all of that is bundled together by the retrofit coordinator, as Ewan mentioned, to create a medium-term improvement plan, which is lodged way off at the data warehouse, looked after by Trustmark. And the idea behind that, it will sit there for 30 years at least, and that will inform future delivery programmes. So one consideration around the local authority delivery scheme phase 2 that we're just in the process of completing the delivery of is that there's a £10,000 per dwelling budget within that. Now, quite obviously, the EPC and the improvement options evaluation might recommend that the person has fabric upgraded within their house, so EWI typically, with the associated ventilation that will be required to remain compliant with PAS 2035. But it might also recommend a heat pump. It might also recommend solar PV. And it's important to be aware that there's not very often money to cover all of the above. So it's important that when we look at the sequencing of measures that are going to be installed, that's done in a nice, compliant and clear manner for everyone involved, but also leaving the client, whether that's you as a housing association or the energy hub if need be, with further information about future installations that could take place as part of subsequent funding programmes. And this all relates into the actual technical specification associated with it. So when I read through the Greater South East's tech spec on day one, it was a bit of a trip down memory lane. because a lot of the content within that was broadly very similar to what we find within the Retrofit Academy's Midlands Retrofit Toolkit, as they call it. So I'd highly recommend a download of that, folks, because that will run through a lot of the pre, mid and post-install considerations as part of setting the scope of any works you intend to conduct. It's also as well to keep sight of what standard are we working towards. So is this all about EIS2? Is it with the obligation to look at EPC Band B by 2032? Are we looking at SAP increases across the board? Are we focusing on energy, as we see perhaps south of the border with the release of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, with a requirement to hit minimum energy consumption per square metre of properties? Or are we looking at a mass decarbonisation programme and getting rid of fossil fuel burning appliances to replace those with net zero or low carbon heating? But also, will we be working to other standards? So the Passive House Enerfit or the AECB carbon lights. And the reason I mention this for you, and I'm conscious that because of the way that Zoom displays folks, that there's a box over on the right-hand side of your screen you might not be able to see. But I'm just going to run through something that I'd like to leave you with, because we've heard obviously today very eloquently from Ewan about what PAS 2035 is, and obviously I've tried to touch upon some of the considerations around the operational delivery of it. But it's important to keep in mind that PAS 2035 in and of itself is an engineered process to manage the risk of inappropriate measures being installed inappropriately. And that's it. Things like technical specification details, the contracting models I've touched upon, budgets, what sort of delivery standard will we work towards, considerations around health and safety, CDM, clerk of works services, contract administration, lots and lots of things that I get asked about on a daily basis are generally all out with the scope of PAS 2035, including, I might add, a requirement to have a post-install EPC created prior to a trustmark lodgement, which quite obviously is something you would be wanting to have as part of a programme of works once it's all completed. So I would recommend reaching out to my colleagues in business development if you want to discuss that in a bit more detail. And we're always happy to be engaged in considerations around some of the things that may be out with PAS 2035 but are important to keep sight of as part of your procurement exercises. And lastly, I mentioned earlier about our recent renewable heat programme we delivered on behalf of Angus Housing Association. That documentation was just pushed last week out there, essentially involving the install of solar PV batteries and air source heat pumps in residents' homes. I'd highly recommend a download of that. Particularly delighted to read about the lady whose electricity bill is now down to £7 a week. Well, certainly as of now, but we'll see what happens within the months ahead. And delighted to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and to Ewan as well. Thank you. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, so we can open it up. If you have any questions for either of the presenters. I would say we've also got some representatives from Scottish Government on the call today as well, if there's any questions that are maybe better directed to them as well. But please fire away, raise your hand if you've got anything that you'd like to ask or pick up on. It's good to see the update on the Angus project as well, because we did have that featured in one of our previous forum sessions as well. So maybe do a further update at that on a future session.
Thank you.
Any questions?
In addition to the slides, I'll stick my email address in the chat in case anyone has any questions to maybe pick up offline.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing for me that you touched on at the end is, you know, which standard are we working to? And obviously the EIS review has just started now, and that's going to be really critical in, you know, determining what the standard for our members is and where we're trying to get to, and then how PAS fits into that. Well, question in the chat there. So from Joe, thank you, Joe. Do you think that we should all be building the medium-term evaluations into our stock conditions?
So in terms of the improvement options evaluation and the plan associated with it, you're absolutely spot on, Joe, in the sense that that's the sort of first part of the process, if you like, and that can be left sitting there until decisions are taken around what delivery is planned, what measures are planned, what retrofit project is getting put together. Similar to the EPCs I mentioned in the presentation, it is totally agnostic. It will always recommend what's appropriate for the property. One thing to touch upon that is that in addition to measures getting introduced that might be out with the scope of the programme of works, it's also possible to add measures in there. So, for example, new doors might not appear as a recommendation on the EPC simply because they won't make a 1 sat point difference, and therefore the recommendation is suppressed by the methodology. However, that might be something that you're considering as part of a mass upgrade programme of works, and the retrofit coordinator can factor that into their calculations as part of that plan. So you would be left with a EPC, retrofit assessment and an improvement options evaluation calculated out based on today's rates or the underlying rates by the retrofit coordinator, even if the planned works isn't due to take place until a later date.
I think to add to that, it's also quite a very useful tool when we've got uncertainty about standards, because meeting each 2 by 2032 and getting an EPC band B doesn't necessarily get you close to where we need to be for net zero. So having a medium-term plan can look at what you're doing at each to achieve each 2, and then look at what you need to do by 2045 to get to net zero as well, and integrate that approach. Because I think that's one of the reasons that each is under review, and one of the difficulties we've had going from each 1 to each 2 is that you install measures, and then if there's a ratcheting up, it's not necessarily easy to increase the wall insulation by 50 millimeters after you've achieved each 2, for example. So we want to avoid dead ends where we're blocking the path towards incremental further improvement.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Any other questions from attendees at all? No. I know that there is the kind of conversation, as I think you touched on earlier on, about what's going to be expected of social landlords going forward. Certainly, I know, speaking to the leads on the social housing net zero heat fund, that there isn't an expectation that this will be introduced as part of that funding scheme, certainly in the near future, and that partly being to do with the kind of skills gap and the difficulties in delivering some of the intricacies of this in rural areas in particular. But yeah, obviously it's required for ECO and other schemes. Another question there from Paul. So is there a group of contractors in Scotland who have been trained to PAS 2035 practices?
So if we're looking at the installers themselves, so their underlying requirement is to the PAS 2030-19 standard, and anecdotally the vast majority of contractors who are compliant with that standard are those involved in eco-funded works, because as Ewan mentioned, that's the only real mandatory scheme operable in Scotland where PAS 2035 compliance is mandated. Now, any of the installers who are active within ECO will have that schedule in place. However, for anyone who's looking at becoming involved in the PAS 2035 process, definitely the time for them is to get moving on it now. Same with your good selves as well. When we were looking at the contracting models, if you were considering some of the in-house options, having your own retrofit coordinators, your own retrofit assessors, I can't emphasize the importance of exploring that in a bit of detail now in terms of upskilling of staff. The retrofit coordinator qualification can take people up to around about a year to gain, would you believe? So in advance of any funding coming along or any requirement to deliver to the standard in other areas, I would highly recommend exploring the options of getting staff upskilled as of now.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left. Any kind of final questions or even just kind of comments? No?
By the way,
Yeah.
a thought just occurred to me there, they're all on Trustmark, so anyone who's up to 2019 standard, 2030-19 is on Trustmark under the Find a Trader function. That's freely available out there in the public domain, so you can look organisations up, search by postcode, and it'll identify who's active in your area.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know there was tons of information in the slides, so they'll go out to everybody, so everyone is free to pick up on any of the detail that maybe missed on the presentations. But thank you, as we said in the chat, it was really informative. You covered a lot of material in a short space of time, so thank you very much. Everybody should see a little evaluation poll popping up on the screen just now, so we'd be grateful if you could fill that in and let us know how you found the session. And lastly, just thank you then to our speakers for taking the time to join us today. Thanks to everyone for attending, and we look forward to welcoming you to another event soon.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.